Hello to everyone around the civilized world. This is our, third last number 8, right? And it's going to be on the issue of force. The evil of the initiation of physical force. And this is the closest we get to politics in this course, because this topic is very much tied into the topic of rights. However, the relation between force and rights, as I said in giving the assignment, is not our subject today. We're concerned with the evil of force as a moral principle, regardless of whether the government does or should do anything about it. A reminder now at the outset, force, and I'm not going to always repeat this long mouthful, force this evening or today means the initiation of physical force. I'll say a few words later about force in retaliation. But as to physical force, as far as philosophy is concerned, no other kind of force is relevant. Not gravitational force, not the force of your boss's personality, not forceful ads on TV, not the force of Ayn Rand's conviction, etc. When we talk about force, the paradigm in your mind is do this or I'll bash your teeth in. In other words, a human violation of your choice through physical, not psychological means. So force is nothing subtle or metaphorical or debatable. It's in essence perceivable by the senses, just as a punch is. Now I checked it out in the dictionary. And the dictionary defines force as physical strength or power exerted upon an object. And I looked up coerce for the heck of it, and they have a good definition of coerce: to compel by physical strength or intimidation without regard for individual desire or volition, which I think captures it very well. Now, so I'll repeat that if you want. Coerce is to compel by physical strength or intimidation without regard for individual desire or volition. Now we allow one indirect form of physical force within our basic philosophic discussion, and that's fraud. For instance, if you lie to get someone's property, you still end up physically taking it over and having it against his will. So your relationship is still a violation of his choice. You merely trick him into doing what only physical force could accomplish without the trick. And in that sense, fraud is included. Now let's begin, as I often do, with a short, sweet, rationalist argument, which people often use to get around the need of induction in this case. And here I hear this all the time. There's only two ways of dealing with people when you disagree with them: reason or its opposite force, persuasion or coercion. We know that reason is good, and therefore force must be bad, must be evil. Now, here are some questions before we jump to take that right as formulated. What about evil people who do neither? That is, they neither use reason nor force when they disagree. For example, they make use of their power of pull to get a good man fired by a private employer. There's no force here, but they're certainly not dealing with others by means of reason. This is what you would call an emotionless type of manipulation. Or how about writing the Critique of Pure Reason and ultimately destroying millions of men? The critique is not an example of reason at work, but is certainly not force either. So you may appreciate Ayn Rand's precision when she never says there's only two ways. She says there are, in essence, only two ways, or there are only two basic ways, precisely to cover this type of situation. Emotionalist manipulation, that form of interaction, has to be simply peripheral. If and when it becomes dominant among people, then there's no reason any longer, if they don't get their way, to regard other people's autonomy as sacrosanct. So they automatically say the only really effective way to achieve your ends is force. So this kind of emotionalism is really, when it becomes a significant factor in human life, a transition from an era of reason to an era of force. So you can subsume it under in essence or basically. But they still have the question from that argument, why are reason and force opposites? And if you simply say reason and force are opposites, you'll get this kind of argument. What if a man won't listen to reason and you force him in the name of reason? Government agencies use that all the time. The FDA, for instance, argues that if the masses were reasonable, government would never need to use force. People would do voluntarily what the authorities have proved. For instance, quit smoking, and then prohibition or regulation wouldn't be needed. And therefore they argue, or advocates of this type of view say, force is a means of reason triumphing. So the two are hardly opposites. And now you might say to me, well, that obviously can't be true. They are opposite because force destroys reason. And then again the question becomes, well, why do you say that? If we just look around us naively, plenty of force is being exerted on businessmen, for example. But the economy is booming. So obviously businessmen are still thinking and using their reason efficiently, even given the force. Now, one person wrote me angrily years ago that if he could talk to Galt while Galt was hooked to the torture machine, he is sure Galt could have recited the multiplication table to him. And surely, he said, that's reason, because animals can't do it, so force does not destroy reason. Now, recently, in preparation for this lecture, I got some more questions. And here was one from a student who has some modest familiarity with objectivism. In essence, I was asked this question. Don't you still have free will under force? And if you have free will, can't you do what you choose with your mind, including thinking? And therefore, you must be able to think under force. And therefore, Ayn Rand is wrong when she says that force destroys reason. This, by the way, is as good an example of rationalism as I have heard. So I've given you now two nakedly opposite rationalist arguments, that reason and force are opposites, that one destroys the other, and the proof that it can't be true through the let's call it the argument from free will. So we have rationalism versus rationalism. And that is the fate of all rationalist arguments. It's just a matter of your creativity. To what extent you can rejigger a series of words to come out with the conclusion that you like, as this questioner has done. Now, the only solution to this kind of rationalist impasse is to go back to induction. Now, I just want to say that I'm not saying the basic dichotomy of reason versus force is not valid. My point is that doesn't stand on its own as a rationalist fragment. If you just utter that the way I did, it's full of holes. It's valid only as a synopsis of a massive series of inductions, and only when you see that that is the material in reality that you're referring to. Not if you just come out and think that's a self-contained statement. Anybody with half a brain or a quarter of an ounce of rationalism will shoot it to pieces. Now, where are we going to get our examples of force? This is actually the easiest of all topics in regard to induction, because force is perceivable. You remember the punch in the face example. As against something like irrationality or injustice, which has countless intangible forms. Here we're talking about a sin easily accessible to the senses. And in fact, it's so cut and dried that there's really only three sources that I can even conceive of to draw examples from. One of them is obviously crime, which is defined in terms of force: robbery, assault, rape, murder, kidnapping, etc. Or the threat of these. Now, let me just point out that very often a threat is the form that force takes, because that enables the criminal to achieve his end without having to do the work and actually dirty his hands. Now the second, I'm not giving these in any order, but just three obvious categories, and the only three I can think of where you could get examples of force, the initiation of force. Two is the government. By definition, it has a monopoly on the use of force, and today its function having been completely inverted, it's the richest vein of examples for us, although these examples are not always clear to youngsters in America, because they're still reasonably sheltered from what a really totalitarian or dictatorship is like. And the third I put in just to round out the possibilities, and you can call this third one non-prosecutable crimes, in quotes. These are cases where the individuals involved have no provable contract and or no way to show damages, and often involve judgment calls about minors, calls which the parents have the right to make and not the government. So here's a case of force which would nevertheless not come under crime as definable in a proper society. A parent who promises to take his child to the movies as a special treat if he spends an extra hour on his homework and then backs out. He says, I'm too busy now, and there's no good movies, etc. And this is a fraud, which amounts to the initiation of force against his child. The child has had an hour of time and effort taken from him against his will, but for all the reasons I mentioned, you can't bring that kind of case to court. So there's an abundant reservoir of examples, and that's where we're going to draw them from. All right, let's go to our reduction. We want to reach the ultimate conclusion that force is anti-reason, that it destroys the process of thought as such. That is the ultimate objectivist reason why it's evil. What would be required to get to that? That is the point we have to reach. Now, on the face of it, that seems untrue to most people, and I've given you some of the obvious reasons. It seems to them that it's perfectly possible to think and function without force preventing that. What would you have to learn in order to make this conclusion reachable? What would you have to learn first in order then finally to come to the conclusion that force attacks the process of reason as such? Well, the first thing you'd have to do, or the thing that you directly preceding this have to do, is grasp that force attacks certain particular conclusions which you hold. Conclusions that you'd worked hard mentally to reach and understand. And once you saw that force was doing something to specific contents of the mind, then you would be more able to grasp that force has some kind of effect on the mind as such, on the cognitive faculty. That it somehow is not something perpetrated just against the body, but that it moves into their minds and wreaks havoc. And you would then be prepared to make the kind of observations necessary to go on to it's an assault on the whole mind. But you'd first have to reach the point of saying it's an attack on specific contents of the mind. So we want to show that force is against mind as such. The precondition of that is to get force into the realm of the mind by grasping that it's against specific conclusions. Now, how do you come to grasp that force is antithetic or negates specific conclusions? Well, you'd have to learn something about what your conclusions are and how you reach them. Most people, if you say to them, force attacks your conclusion, would not be able to see that because force doesn't necessarily operate directly against some particular idea that you hold. What is the form in which people are, any person would be clear right away, whether he's a thinker or not, whether he knows about his mental contents and his conclusions or not. The first obvious thing to a child, even before he knows about premises, conclusions, when force is initiated against him, what is he directly able to perceive? And speaking rhetorically, he knows that force is making him do something that he doesn't want to do, that it's going against a desire of his. And that would be our direct datum that we can get directly from reality. So, turning around now in the inductive direction, I'd say the first thing you have to grasp is that force negates your personal or selfish desires. This is directly observable, and that's the way the concept of force as nature and evil is originally grasped. And then second, at some point we come to grasp where our desires come from. That underlying each desire is a cognition, is an idea of some kind, is knowledge of some kind. So that if force is anti-desire, that means it's really anti-cognition in the sense of forcing us to nullify, ignore, or act against specific conclusions. That's the second stage, and that's where we see force as the enemy of the content of thought. Now, at a later point, when we've learned something more about the mind, we discover, as we have in this course already discovered, that integration is essential to the mind. So the question occurs, isn't an assault on specific conclusions implicitly an assault on the essential process of thought? Because it's tearing something out of an integrated totality. And now we're ready to induce from observation that force destroys the conceptual cognitive process as such, that it's not merely against specific conclusions, but against the mind as such. It's what we can call a cognitive paralyzer. So this is the agenda. 1, direct observation of force negating desires. Then, via grasping premises underlying desires, direct observation of force negating specific conclusions, and finally, direct observation of force paralyzing the mind as such, stopping it via grasping that it brings to a screeching halt the process of connecting or integrating, and therefore paralyzes the mind. Now that's what I say is the agenda given to us by reduction. So let's plunge in with the first point. Force versus desires, or versus your values. Now the first examples of force that you're likely to encounter will involve lies or broken promises by adults or physical threats from other kids. I gave the example of the extra homework in exchange for the special movie, which was tantamount to extorting the child's labor against his wish. Or a bully threatens to beat up a freshman in high school unless he agrees never to date Miss X. Now you can yourself supply the range and quantity of cases, but the obvious conclusion from this type of example, which you don't need much brains or evidence to grasp, is that force, whether direct or indirect, makes me do what I don't want to do. To the extent that I'm under force, I'm forbidden to do or to have or to pursue or to keep what I want, what I desire, what I value. Now let's ask, how would a youngster at this early stage recognize that this is wrong? Now here I think you can't grasp that something is wrong except in the context of knowing that something else is right. And I say you could only recognize that this was wrong if you had reached some, at least early stage of grasping, what? Well, you say justice, but in a very allied thing, egoism as being right. In other words, I think he would first have to have induced the conclusion, so-and-so are my values. It's they're mine to choose and mine to enjoy. In other words, to reach the conclusion, it's good for me to pick the values that I want and then go after and enjoy them for my own sake. And if you've already induced that much, even if you don't have a whole theory of egoism, but just that much, then you will experience right away the conclusion it's wrong for someone to regard me or my values as a means to the ends of others. Because that's the clearest opposite possible to the notions that the values you choose are up to you to act on and achieve. So the first induction is really within the framework of grasping the validity of egoism on some early contextual level. You grasp that force is the opposite of your selfish values. Now, I would say Ayn Rand had this point by the age of 6. I'm sure of that. Because that does not take too much complexity. Now, I think most people would still be very clear at this stage. They see clearly the dichotomy of force versus their desire. But they never get past this stage. And they actually never reach an actual concept of force because they conflate, they lump together a number of essentially different issues. And they put them all under, it's what I want versus that. And under that is mixed indiscriminately. The initiation of force, the laws of reality, and the prerogatives of the legitimate prerogatives of other people. So there's a number of different cases here. There's the bully case. There's the law of gravity, which can interfere with your desire. And there's the fact that you can be frustrated at dealing with non-criminals who don't want to give you what you want. And if you lump all that together as X and call it either they or the system or fate or whatever, and identify it as that stops me from doing what I want. Now, if this was a legitimate conceptualization, all of that went together as the enemy of my desire, then there would be no further induction here. If the alternative we face is either I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, no matter what, or I'm under force, then life involves force. The concept is useless, and the issue is not appropriate to discussion. And of course, you've all, I'm sure, met people who dismiss the whole issue this way, saying there is no such thing as absolute freedom. Nobody can do whatever he wants. When you live in society, we're all limited, etc. All of those people are in this category, that they cannot distinguish different sources of preventing them from acting on their desire. So the inducer is going to have to break up this conglomeration. And I would say he's going to have to separate out 3 completely independent factors, each by a variety of examples. First, he's going to have to grasp that reality is not an agent of force. It's the setting and the metaphysical context of all voluntary action. Only people can be forcers in this context. Not even animals can. If your dog bars your path, that's not force exerted on you. That's like the law of gravity, because we're discussing morality. So if your desire is to jump off the Empire State Building but not fall, or to eat your employer and still have the job too, then you've got a worse problem than criminals. That is, you're undertaking a war against reality as such, and that has to be segregated out as completely separate from what we're talking about. Then there's secondly the frustration of a person's desire by others, which is not necessarily force, because other people have their own lives just as you do. This is the issue that egoism is a principle that reached by induction. And there's therefore a fundamental difference between people refusing to give you something you want, which is theirs to decide about. That is not force, even if they're wrong, as against their forcing you to act against your desires. So you've got to learn the difference, for instance, between we hate you, whether right or wrong, so we won't give you such and such, versus we hate you, so we're going to throw you in the river with cement weights tied to your legs. The second is force. And now one more that a beginning inducer, a child, has to learn, and that is he has to learn that his parents can legitimately initiate physical force. I'm using those words deliberately. Then that does not come under the principle of the initiation of physical force as evil. Remember, philosophy applies to adults, and there are separate rules for the transition from birth as you're developing the rational faculty. And there are cases where a child that isn't grown, the parents, if they're proper parents, are morally obligated to carry out their responsibility of bringing up the child a certain way, including punishing him against his will when it's necessary and appropriate. Now remember that even if you put your toddler into timeout, that is not voluntary, and that is not necessarily a retaliation against his use of force. He may just have been cranky and noisy or whatever. This is a distinction that kids are going to have to grasp before they can grasp the issue of force, because they are so much under the jurisdiction of their parents that it's very hard for them to separate out reality from other people forcing them, because their parents can frequently have to force them. But I think most kids don't find it that hard to grasp the difference between firm parents and criminal parents. I know many kids of 8 who have no trouble distinguishing reality, other people, and parental prerogatives from the obvious case of a bully without any rights in the situation coming up and smashing them in the face. And that's basically the distinction you have to be able to make to proceed beyond simply force versus my desire, because force otherwise is going to stand for just anything that frustrates me. Now, if you've made these distinctions, then you've isolated what Ayn Rand calls the initiation of force against the innocent. That's a distinction within the framework of human behavior, which contrasts to justified force by adults and unjustified force by criminals or governmental or otherwise. So we now can say within that understanding that that's what we're talking about by force. The initiation of force is evil because it's the opposite and destroyer of the victim's selfish values, of any victim's selfish values. All right, now I go on to the next step. How do we get to the conclusion that force is the opposite not merely of your selfish desires or values, but also of a specific intellectual content in your mind, of ideas or conclusions which you hold? Now, we're not yet trying to go to the final stage that it stops thought as such, simply that it nullifies or negates or discards certain specific conclusions in your mind. Now, how will we get to this step? What is required? Well, you obviously have to discover that the desires you want, the values you choose, themselves come from ideas and conclusions that you yourselves reached. And then you could say the forcer nullifies not merely the value in question, but also the ideas that led me to it. Now, this involves a big discovery on your part, which you can only reach by induction. And that is that all values beyond the level of the sensory perceptual, in other words, the purely physicalistic and automatic, all values are a product of ideas that you hold. And this is only arrivable at on the basis of observation and induction. Now, you don't have to, have a full knowledge of this in order to make the discovery in connection to force. Some people can have a broader understanding of the role of ideas, others a lesser. But you have to get the key point in some form that your conclusions about values, that your desires come from some kind of ideas or knowledge that you have formed by your mind. It might be a knowledge of the effects of different objects, and or a knowledge of several possibilities open to you when you choose, and or a knowledge of the means of gaining various objects, of the difficulties involved. But the point is, you had to raise certain kinds of questions in some version, make a decision, and choose a value or goal. And then the forcer comes up to you and says, forget about all that and do what I say or else. Well, once you've brought it to that point, you see that he's not merely against what you want, but against what you specifically had to think, the question and answer sequence that led you to that desire. Now, I don't think you need a whole theory that emotions come from ideas. At this stage of the game, I think you can do it simply on individual instances, on a common sense observation, without discussing the broader topic, do emotions or desires all come from ideas? And I think the easiest direction to go for data here is self-observation, assuming you've generally been reasonable in picking your values and goals. The more casually and unthinkingly you have made your decisions, the less you will notice the role of cognition on your part in making them. Obviously, in the extreme case where the person practices blind self-indulgence or blind obedience to his neighbors, he will maybe be able to find no ideas of his own when he introspects. Nothing behind his behavior except just he wants to do it. Now, of course, ideas of some kind cause and underlie evaluations, even among those who are so mindless that they don't notice it. But the more you think, by contrast, the more clearly you will be able to see this point. So someone like Ayn Rand will be able to grasp very early that this is an assault on her conclusions. Someone who more accepts what is current and is not conscious or aware, doesn't monitor the process of conclusions, will take a lot more data and a lot longer development, or they may need to be provoked by somebody else giving them the idea. Now let's take just a ridiculous example. One type of person can pick a toothbrush intellectually. They weigh from the aspect of the strength of the bristles, the curvature of the tip, the ease of handling, the price, etc. Now suppose you're that kind, and you go through this process, you decide on one, and then a competing manufacturer holds a knife to your throat and says, take this other toothbrush or else. Well, you see at once that that threat amounts to saying, ignore the conclusions you've just reached. It's not simply saying go against a specific value that you want, but all of the various conclusions that you considered that led you to it. So you will be indignant in this case not only because you're losing the toothbrush, but because the forcer has in essence invaded your mind and said in regard to this issue, these ideas or considerations of yours are inoperative. Forget about them. Now contrast that with you wander around in a daze, you grab the first toothbrush you see, and the same guy pulls it out of your hand and substitutes another brand from the shelf instead, saying, this one's better, just give it a try. Go on, hurry up, people are waiting. And you figure, well, what do I care? You shrug and buy it. Now, if you are that type, there's no reasons behind what you do, then you're not going to be that indignant at having your reasons countermanded, because they're not there. And you will have a great deal of difficulty inducing the conclusion that ideas or knowledge lead to desires or choices. Now, you can obviously apply the same contrast and all the intermediary degrees to all values, including careers and romance. Even if your ideas are right or wrong about them, it makes no difference. If you're rational, it's still your ideas, your best conclusions, that the forcer is making you divorce from your action. Now, at this point, you have to go out and make the observations. And the principle you want to reach is, it's force versus your specific conclusions. And I mean specifically the reasons, the observational data that led you to those conclusions. So it's force versus your knowledge, what you concluded is true. And you have to come to see that force makes you bypass your cognition. It makes your cognition useless to the extent of the force. And that's what is behind Ayn Rand's statement that to compel a man to act against his judgment is like compelling him to act against his own sight. Now, you have to see that as the step toward reaching that it's an attack on the eyes as such. But here you see it's an attack on a specific use of the eyes. You're saying, close your eyes, to hell with that. Don't, it doesn't make any difference what you see. You have to walk in the opposite direction. Now, you see, if you see this clearly, that it's what you see is leading you to where you want to walk, then you have the capacity to go on to grasp that it's an assault on the eyes as such. But if all you know is I want to walk there, and you're completely, if I dare use this term, blind about the role of your eyes, then you're not going to grasp that it's any kind of attack on your vision, and you're cut off from coming to the ultimate conclusion. So the clarity of the induction here depends on your ability to reach the induction, that when there's a goal, by a human being, it comes from some kind of cognitive judgments that he has made. And the assault on his desire is an assault on his judgment. Now, this is not the same point, although it's true that force acts as a disincentive to future thinking. Obviously it does. There's not a motivation for thinking, if and to the extent that you can't act on what you think, because thought is for the sake of action. But that's a common point. That is not the distinctive objectivist argument against force. It's not the argument that force takes away the motivation to think, although that's obviously true. What we're going to try to develop is the point that force actually makes it impossible to think whether you want to or not, no matter what your motive is. And the key to it is going to be to grasp how we go from taking that metaphor of the eyes, it's against specific use of the eyes, to it's against the organ, the faculty as such. And that's what we have to do now to reach force, the final stage, which is the ultimate objectivist objection to force, that it's an assault on the faculty of thought as such, not only on specific conclusions. How would you get to reach this conclusion? Now we're set up to be able to reach it. because we've entered the realm of the mind, but we still have to reach it. The discovery, let's put it this way, that force paralyzes the mind as such. I think that's the best word, because that means it stops it from functioning. And we mean by paralysis, when we're speaking, ultimately, it stops the process of thought about everything. Now, do we reach this point by deduction from some knowledge we have about the mind? No, I would say that will be back to an improper method. Just in the same way we had to induce on the preceding level, we have to induce here. We have to induce a connection, which we're now ready to do, between force and mental paralysis by actually observing the paralysis. And then we bring in the knowledge we have about the mind in analyzing and explaining the paralysis that we observe. And I want to say a word here about paralysis, because this may make this topic easier for you to understand. Paralysis is not unique to force. All bad ideas, and sometimes even true ones in a tragic context, lead to paralysis of some kind. Force merely leads to it, more directly and obviously, and without the victim having any choice in the matter. And specifically, force leads to mental paralysis, not primarily action paralysis, although that is a consequence. Now, let's just see more broadly. You could make the point, for instance, that a completely false theory of ethics will ultimately paralyze you if you are consistent. If you're a consistent altruist and you regard all values and ideas that you hold, everything defined by you, emanated by you, everything that you want and cherish is forbidden as selfish. Well, then, how do you function? You're left helpless without any guide as to what to think or want or do. Now, then there's various solutions to this problem that basically that altruists have to adopt. You have to somehow deliver yourself over to others and wait for direction. But which order, which direction from which others? Perhaps you're going to only act in response to the loudest social voice, or you're just going to conform to everything as it comes along, or you'll break down into total despair and depression and do nothing at all. Now, the point is here, you can see just on this example, and this is by your own decision to accept the altruist philosophy. It's irrelevant, reverting back to that earlier rationalist argument that I was asked about, to say, but the altruist has free will. He has placed blocks within his own mind against his ability to function. So it's irrelevant to say, well, he has free will. He has free will, but free will doesn't make you omnipotence. The mind has certain requirements of being able to function. And if you stuff it full of a content that is incompatible with its ability to generate action, you can't say, well, why don't you use your free will? Take another example, which again does not involve force. If you start to think about the arbitrary, that is to say, an idea sundered from all evidence. I wrote a chapter about this in OPAR, and I can't go into it here, but those of you who know it, I make the point that if something is sundered from all evidence, it's absolutely arbitrary, like the idea there are gremlins. There's no way you can prove or refute. There's no mental activity that you can engage in about this. You're simply stopped, because there's nothing to look to say, this is to show it doesn't exist. Say, well, you can't see it. It's invisible. Well, you can't hear it. It's inaudible, etc. So it's no use you telling me, well, I have free will. I can do whatever I want with my mind, and I've decided to think about the proof of gremlins. There's nothing to think about. It is impossible to do it. Your mind has to just simply stop. Now, in the case of altruism or the case of the arbitrary, that is your fault. You accept the paralyzing agent voluntarily, and you can get rid of it in the same way. In the case of force, however, the paralysis is not your fault. And that is the unique, lethal nature of force. It's the one and only way you can be stopped mentally by others. In other words, your tool of survival be turned off by them, not by your own errors or conclusions or despair. And that is what makes it such a monstrous evil. Now, I don't know whether this is of any value to you. I found the following helpful. This is not the basic genus for this whole category, but it was, to me, it was helpful as a display of all the different categories of paralysis. So I worked this out just so you could see where force fits in this total picture. And the basic genus that I used here is paralysis is anti-life. Life involves action, and therefore the freezing of action, the incapacity to action, is destructive of life. And then I divided paralysis into of the body, like polio or etc., and paralysis of the mind. And then that I subdivided the latter into self-caused paralysis versus externally caused. And self-caused would include all the different ideas or conclusions which could stop a mind, such as an impossible moral code, or even just an impossible blatant contradiction, like I must do this but I can't do this. And self-caused might subsume extreme depression or extreme anxiety or various paralyzing emotional but self-induced states. On the other hand, by contrast, externally caused paralysis would be force and only force. Now that to me gives you a kind of a picture of paralysis, which shows what the unique element of force is. Now I say that this is not the basic genus in today's induction, because you don't, when you're inducing, distinguish force from polio or from impossible moral codes. The basic distinction is force versus persuasion. So this is basically a side issue, but it's one that I think gives you a picture of the evil of force by showing you with what kinds of things it's similar and different. If you want the basic genus here, I don't think the basic genus in this case is helpful to guiding the induction, but I think the basic genus would be human interactions have consequences on the mind. And then you could subdivide that into those interactions in which represent or exhibit respect for the autonomy of the person, as against those which assault or negate the person's autonomy. And the latter would be force. Now, I don't know if that helps or not. It didn't help me particularly. All right, so now what we have to do is observe this unique paralysis that force engenders. Now, the procedure here is one that John Stuart Mill discovered, and he called it concomitant variations. As one thing goes up, the other goes up. And in this case, as the force increases, this is inverse variation. As the force increases, the amount of thinking that you do decreases. If the force is circumscribed to a certain area, then you're paralyzed within that one area. And then what you come to see is that neither the force nor the paralysis can go on being circumscribed. If the forcer isn't removed 100%, then the force grows, and as it grows, so does the victim's paralysis. Or if you can put it negatively, his capacity to shrink, to think shrinks. Think shrinks, right? And ultimately, as the one becomes total as force, so does the other, paralysis. So it's an issue of degrees here. I am not out to prove, because it would not be true, that every act of force instantly paralyzes the whole mind of the victim and makes thinking about anything impossible. That is obviously ridiculous. And only a rationalist from a graduate school in hell could dream up such an interpretation. What Ayn Rand says is that any one act of force on one innocent man will necessarily lead, if not counteracted, to total paralysis for all the victims involved, ultimately. But ultimately can take a long time, can take generations, and it works by degrees. That doesn't alter the fact that force is the antithesis of mind. What it means is you can't close down a whole mind until you introduce total force. And so far as you circumscribe the force, you circumscribe the effects on the mind, but you can only circumscribe for a delimited period of time once you start out on that track. And the result is that the end is going to be the total against the total. Now let's take an example from government, because it's the only force-wielding agency that could paralyze a country as a whole. Let's start with force on a delimited scale. A businessman decides that he can and should be making a higher profit from his company. He's thought about it, he's researched it, has consulted various experts, etc., and he's come to the conclusion that he can either make a product of the same quality more cheaply, and therefore more profit per unit, or pay the workers less. And as he's considering those possibilities, he gets a call from Washington to tell him that the Wagner Act prohibits lowering the wages, and the Sherman Act prohibits showing more profit per unit, because people at the Justice Department are starting to think that he's in a monopolistic position. Now at this point, there is no way for the businessman to think about higher profits through either of these policies, wage policy or profit per unit. This is now a question outside of his mind's power to deal with. Now what you have to see here, and this is really crucial, is that these government decrees are not like new facts of reality that a person could discover in the course of thinking that thwart your goal. For instance, it's not as though it's like the Wright brothers working to discover the airplane, and some obstacle has been found that thwarts them from flying. It's not facts that you can question or try again to get around, or some problem to solve or integrate into a non-contradictory whole. The analogy would be the Wright brothers are there struggling to get the plane to operate, and they get a message from the FAA, wings are anathema. They're out, that's it. Now, go ahead and invent a plane, but we have a gun, and any wings on that plane and we shoot you dead. Now that is what is involved here. It's not a fact of reality that you can question and adapt and so on to. It's simply a gun that says, there's whatever you're thinking on these 2 points, no matter how true to reality, it's out. Now, of course, the man can still think about a lot of things. He can think about how to bribe or kill the forcers involved. But if he tries to think about increasing profits through those 2 methods, he can't. And the point is that he's paralyzed. Not because he doesn't have the motive to think. Let us say he wants to think, and he still has free will. He can still do with his mind what he chooses. But he no longer has the means necessary to think about those questions, because he's being told, in effect, think about this topic, be reasonable, look to the facts, follow logic, but don't you dare do that, because our guns take precedence and nullify facts that your mind regards as essential. Now, that is a classic formula of intellectual paralysis. I must think about this item because that's what reality says. And I can't think about this item because the gun is going to go off. Now, that is the clash that defines paralysis. And the only way out when you're confronted between I must and I can't is you give up the I must, because you can't do anything about the I can't. And here is where the crucial issue is, the fact that the mind is an organ of cognition, and it can function only as that. And it's now being given the assignment, think, acquire information, function as a knower, but ignore crucial knowledge. Don't understand and connect every point. There are some revelations that you have to build into the process. Now, that is what I say, as what Ayn Rand says. It doesn't make any difference whether you have free will or you don't have free will. You cannot do it. You cannot do it with that instrument, with the mind. It's not that you don't want to think. You would love to think if you were allowed to think reasonably. The fact is that he can't think. All that he can do, if he wants to use his free will, is think about lowering wages as a fantasy of what he might do someday if he lived in Atlantis. And then it assumes in his life the role of a fantasy, and in this case a hopeless fantasy. In other words, it's wistful pleasure, part pain, and completely useless practically, because you still have to go on functioning here and now. So it's simply off the table as a factor in life. Now, if you understand just this small example of how a given question becomes literally unthinkable about, because to think about it, you have to evade facts of reality, or cut them out. And that's not an issue of choice. You could just run through the whole rest of it and see how the final conclusion is inevitable. Suppose the man says, well, okay, I'm going to be really ingenious. I won't try either of those methods. I'll come up with a whole new way of increasing my profit. And he thinks of a way to borrow some money to spend on more advertising, say, and TV advertising, and expand his customers. And he gets a clearance from the Justice Department and the Labor Department. He's going to use the same workers, the same hours, the same wages, the same profit per unit, but he'll sell more units. And now he can think enthusiastically again, even with the first two paths blocked. And let's say he has it all set up. He promises to pay the banker back, by the way, by the added sales he expects, and he's got to produce the extra units with the same labor. He's got to use the same labor. He plans to use new machinery that he himself just invented and patented. So everything is fine, and he's thinking again, but he just cut out the other problems. After a day, a week, a year, a decade, depending upon the historical context, he gets some messages. The FCC says that his increased advertising is an unfair use of the public airwaves and is prohibited. And the unions say that your added sales are through new machinery, even if our hours are technically the same, are making us work mentally much too hard. We can't start retraining with new equipment at this stage. It's an unfair labor practice. And the Patent Office comes up with the ruling that in a democracy, inventions belong to all the people. And Alan Greenspan says that speculative loans by the banks may possibly be a cause of inflation because there's too much irrational exuberance, and that they should be restricted. And meanwhile, all the friends of Lee Iacocca who is the leader of his competitors, are agitating for more subsidies and more tariffs and claiming that he's making too much profit. Now the question is, how much more does anybody need to reach a conclusion? At some point, the man realizes, and he actually gets to the stage where he cannot think at all about the issue of how to improve his profit or his sales. It's an undealable with dead issue because every essential relevant fact has been declared off limits. So his thinking on the whole question is now impossible. Even though he's got free will, he still can't, there's nothing to think about. There's only a series of contradictions. This is true, but they won't let it be true. This is practical, but illegal. I must, and I can't. And here again, the issue is not motivation, but epistemological possibility. And the end of the line has to be just what it is under totalitarianism, under Nazism and communism. Everybody in any line of endeavor follows the specific procedures laid down by the government, and no deviations are allowed without special permission, which itself is a function of unknowable pull. So you just sit back, give up creative thought, and wait for the SS or the IRS or the Friends of Bill or the Friends of Bob Dole's law partners to tell you what to do. And that's all you can do. So the general process is delimited force leads to paralysis and the delimited issues involved. And then since each act of government force leads to further such acts, the end of the road is total force and therefore total paralysis in all areas under the reach of the government. Now, you might say, well, that's just economics, that's just businessmen, but what about thinking about real truths like scientists? Would scientific thinking be affected by force? Now, if you ask that question, that is just like, well, I see that it's bad for the coal industry, but what about the steel industry? What is a scientist? Scientists and businessmen are interchangeable in this issue. What is a scientist's mind supposed to do when he's told by a dictator, for instance, you're free to think about astronomy, but the Bible comes above the telescope? Or you can think whatever you want about biology, but you must remember the principle of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Or, and these are, of course, I'm giving you real cases. Or you can think about building the atom bomb, but you can only use Newton laws, not those of the Jew Einstein. In other words, you're free to pursue knowledge, but you must not come up with X as any part of the answer, or you must come up with a Y, counter to reality. This is the exact same issue as the businessman, and it's the exact same contradiction. If you reach a forbidden answer, then you're lost. If you don't reach the desired answer, you're lost. So neither the businessman nor the scientist can think for the same reason. And the principle here is you can't function as a knower while evading crucial knowledge. That's the induction has to ultimately grasp. It's just as a parallel to you can't know while evading, because that leaves these holes, but you don't, that just leaves a fog with a, you don't know the connection of the grounding of the rest of what you have. The forcer is mandating a disintegration, is mandating a form of evasion. And in that same way, you simply can't know. Now, you can think in a delimited fashion so long as they leave you a delimited area. But the point is, just as any one act of force leads all the way down, you have to remember that all issues in the universe are interconnected. It's one universe. So each chunk that you're not allowed to see spreads to the next one. And you finally get to the point where there is nothing you can do under that system. You can't think in defiance of your own knowledge. You can't make connections when integration is prohibited. And I think the best sentence I had about this in OPAR is, and this is the broadest principle, when reality is decreed at gunpoint to be out of bounds, a rational mind has no way to proceed. I think that's the best statement I made on this. And that's what it amounts to. So the degrees of thinking is just a matter of how much of reality you're allowed to have access to. And since it's all interconnected, and the very conditions of the forcer is requiring him to constantly expand the area, it's just a matter of time before the principle works out in its naked form of thinking versus force, and the force engenders total paralysis. Now, as an exercise in clarifying this issue, what can Galt think about in the torture scene? Because that was supposed to be the climax of the book and the example of force versus thought. And let's assume that the pain is not so bad that he can in some way use his mind at all. Well, he can think, if you want to call it that, about how to repair the torture machine. He actually does that, let alone reciting the multiplication table. Now, why is he able to do that? Of course, he couldn't even think about repairing the torture machine if they told him that it is illegal to use any more power tonight. Now think about repairing the machine, and it's finished. He can't do it. He can think about 1,000 things, but he can't think about how to do what he knows to be impossible. Now, how is it that he can think about the torture machine? Well, here it's an obvious question of he simply has to voice the obvious. In other words, take knowledge already automatized and let obvious applications of it pop into his mind without any effort. You can do what's already automatized. But the big question is, can he think about what the torturers want him to think about? Namely, figure out a creative solution to their problem. Figure out how to reach prosperity under the rule of Mr. Thompson. And the point is that he can't. He has free will, but he still can't do it. If he tried, he'd be stopped dead by the contradictions involved. And this is not an issue of his integrity. Even if he knows that it means his own death next week not to think about the issue, he still can't do it. Because he'd have to think about the following problem. Quote, prosperity requires freedom. Now, how can we achieve it without freedom? That's what they want him to think about. And obviously, on the face of it, it's an impossibility. And it's irrelevant. It's nonsense to say, but he has free will. Now, you might say, well, couldn't he think honestly and creatively about how to fake an answer? How to try to pretend to please Dr. Ferris, which might take ingenuity. And yes, certainly, and he would do precisely such thinking in a second if he believed he could escape thereby. But in the context of the story, the climax is an all-or-nothing confrontation, and he has no desire to prolong it by faking, because at this stage he knows that in a few weeks the country is going to collapse no matter whether he fakes or not, so faking is useless. Now, I need one more clarification that might be helpful here. Anyone under the rule of total force can still think creatively underground, assuming he's left alone for a while. In other words, you can smuggle thought into your mental processes as long as the forcers don't discover it. Which means you have to give up any attempt to make your conclusions public or act on them. As long as you're not driven insane or kept on public display in continuous meetings, which was the point in We the Living. The reason for all those continuous meetings all the time was so that you were never left alone to be able to think. You were always, your mind was always occupied in perceiving irrelevancies so that they would never leave you alone. And which is common method of dictatorship. But assuming you're not under continuous surveillance, you're left alone and sane sometimes, you can keep your mind active. You can think in your basement until President Clinton catches you down there. Of course, you have to do this thinking. Assuming we're not talking about a means of escape, but long-term creative work, with the understanding that it won't do you or the world any practical good, and on the contrary, it'll actively harm you if any notes are discovered. Basically, you'd have to project a person working on developing a rational science as a private fantasy. Now, this is conceivable, but it's dangerous practically because there's always a risk of being caught. And it's dangerous epistemologically because you have to go through a horrible double-entry bookkeeping. Because there's has to be one column what you're supposed to think on each item and one what you actually think. It's like a nightmare graduate school, which drives many people crazy right now when they go to it voluntarily. But imagine that the graduate school was running the entire country. Yes. And that all you could do was hide out in the basement and have some thoughts, keeping them secret, and always remembering that the opposite, what exact opposite you're supposed to be saying when you come out in public. That is a formula for driving anybody crazy. But this is what Ayn Rand thought that geniuses actually did for 1,000 years during the Dark and Middle Ages. She thought that the great minds of that whole millennium, because communications and transportation were so primitive, worked in secret and had a pretty good chance of not being discovered, especially in out-of-the-way monasteries, and then destroyed their works at their death. And the reason she thought that, although obviously we have no evidence of it, is she said if you agree that man is self-made and he's not just a product of his environment, how could the human intellect simply disappear for 1,000 years? And so she thought that's what happened. But I think you see that this kind of underground fantasy pursuit is not relevant to survival or the handing on of knowledge, as proved by the whole fact that that was a total dead end historically. It really belongs in the category how to keep busy playing chess until you die. But in terms of life and reality, the principle is thought and force are simply antonyms. Now, we should take a quick look at history, which is essential in this kind of induction. And here you have the full spectrum of concomitant variations, arranged by degrees, if you rearrange the historical order a bit. As one extreme of freedom, there's the period, the first century of the United States. Virtual total absence of the initiation of force by the government, and concomitantly a massive explosion of thought, science, invention, industrialization, economic growth. So no force, unlimited thought. Now going up the scale negatively, next would be, say, the modern mixed economy, which is part force and part thought and comes in all degrees, from around 1890 US, the freest version, to 1932 Germany, which is the end of the Weimar Republic just before Hitler. So you have a whole scale of degrees. And in mixed economy, some areas were still off limits to the forcers, so innovation was still possible to an extent in the uncontrolled areas, such as computers today, as against the stagnating deterioration and absence of thought in the more controlled parts. Now go in the same malignant direction to Egypt in the Middle Ages, which was total force in theory, although they weren't efficient or technologically advanced enough to implement the force perfectly in practice. And notice, even here, despite the inefficiency of the rulers, they were utterly intellectually stagnant centuries, where thought was pretty almost totally atrophied. For instance, the Egyptians prided themselves on the absence of new ideas across thousands of years. They boasted that they didn't change even in small details across millennia. And of course, the Middle Ages, until the later part, under the stimulus of the rediscovery of antiquity, deliberately hurled all pagan knowledge aside, denounced new ideas, prohibited the ancients' books, smashed their statues. And the only choice for thinkers in these civilizations was to go underground or escape to a better civilization, as the better Egyptians escaped in later years to the classical world, and the better medievals fled to the Arabs. And then we get to the finale, the rule of force totally enforced, not only in theory, but actually in practice, where force is maintained regularly over the citizens. They're supervised, watched, their ideas checked, their actions monitored, and there's no hiding, no faking, no underground, no escape. And that's where force is the daily rule and not the part-time or the exception. Now, very small-scale examples would be like Kyrgyz in Sparta or Savonarola in Geneva. But major examples are, and the first ever would be modern totalitarian dictatorships that lasted for decades across whole continents and piled up millions of corpses. And that's only in our century. And here the Nazis are not as good an example as the communists because they lasted too short a time. Because total paralysis across a whole nation takes a few years to set in. People have to discover that it's hopeless to think in this area and this area and this area. They basically have to induce the conclusion that wherever they turn, that they can't escape, that going underground is really dangerous, and above all, they have to get over their initial belief that this government is going to be over soon, as Ayn Rand's father, for example, kept thinking that the communists can't last. Now, if Hitler had been dealing with second or third generation statist victims, then the utter collapse of thought and disappearance of its products would have been as obvious as it was under communism from the start, because communism was already dealing with victims of force for the preceding centuries under the czars. And you know what you saw, that the perfect example of force versus thought was the rule of total force in communism, and the concomitant was a nation failing in absolutely every area that involved creativity, except what did the Soviet Union do well in? Chess, which was the fantasy realm. You don't need to connect to reality. Or purely physical sports like the Olympics. Or the other thing they could do well is reproduce slavishly in every detail pre-communist operettas, which they did strictly for foreign exchange. But any time that thought was involved, then nobody could do it. Neither work, art, science, nature, man, or life, and therefore they had nothing of value to make or trade in any of those fields. And in fact, the results were so total. I mean, the cessation of thought and therefore of production was so total that Gorbachev came, and that's his historical role, so to speak, came to realize that if he didn't allow at least an iota of thought, they would all literally starve. So he made the disastrous mistake, disastrous to him, of removing some items of force, some controls, especially in regard to censorship, and of allowing little bits of economic freedom. And that promptly generated nationwide rebellion, even by thoroughly mystical, mindless, submissive Russians. Now that might surprise you, but that would be because you're confused by the unique perversions of life in the United States. The ignorant Russian peasants may not be much as specimens of humanity, but they are a lot closer to reason, reality, and morality than American college professors. So you shouldn't be surprised that they act much more rationally. Now, it's interesting to note that all of these regimes that specialized in force were openly anti-reason as part of their ideology. The Egyptians and the medievals openly believed in faith and theocracy. The Nazis, of course, denounced reason in favor of racial instinct. The communists denounced Aristotle in favor of dialectic logic. Whereas the United States, Western Europe, the Enlightenment was all pro-reason. So what is the primacy here? Force, and therefore anti-thought, therefore more intense force, etc., or anti-reason, and therefore force, and therefore less thought. And of course, Ayn Rand's point is that it works either way. That's her point, that faith and force are corollaries, and reason and freedom are corollaries. But what we need to know is simply that in obliterating thought, the forces were not producing an unexpected consequence. They wanted the mindlessness that they got, and they knew what they wanted, and they got it. So the final induction from history supports what we said, that force and thought are literal antonyms. And thus Ayn Rand's conclusion in Galt's speech that this is not an overstatement, it's an exact inductive conclusion demanded by the observed data at home and abroad from prehistory to today. And this is Galt's statement. Whoever, to whatever purpose or extent, initiates the use of force is a killer acting on the premise of death in a manner wider than murder, the premise of destroying man's capacity to live. Now that should be clear. His capacity to live, because his capacity to grasp reality. It is his capacity to know, to destroying his mind. Now, if you're wondering about the retaliatory use of force, let's assume that force against criminals and killers does paralyze them and stop their mental processes. My attitude to that is so much the better. That's tough on them. The principle of justice is precisely to paralyze those kind of people. Now I want to say a few words about integrating force into the rest of what we've done. Now, since force is a negative, and our past classes have been mostly positive, this should clash head-on with most of what we've already validated. In other words, the issue of force. Of course, it doesn't clash with cause and effect. It's an example of an evil cause leading to an evil effect. Nothing can clash with the metaphysical principle. Now, if we know that force clashes with reason, going back to reason as man's means of survival, what is it going to do with man's capacity to survive? Obviously, it's going to clash with production. And thus we can explain the poverty and pitiful lifespan, etc., of all of the force-ridden countries. What about egoism? Well, we already discussed that. Being an egoist is a precondition of grasping the evil of force, and the essence of force, and the very first thing we grasped about it, is to annul people's selfish values. What about justice? Well, the initiation of force is an extreme example of injustice, of the infliction of an undeserved negative. And who are its main victims? The primary and major harm that it does is to thinkers, because that's whom it prevents, so it takes the good and penalizes them for being the good. Whereas dolts under dictatorship are often handed out benefits for being dolts, as for instance President Bush's ADA, which was an example of that. What about force and objectivity? Well, here it's really clear, I think. Objectivism demands objectivity and therefore bars the initiation of force. But the subjectivist has no basis that's binding on others intellectually. so he can deal with dissenters only via might makes right. So he's led to the initiation of force. And the intrinsicist requires the equivalent of a revelation from knowledge, which only a mystic elite can attain, as in Plato's philosopher king theory. So there's no option but for that elite to impose its superior revelation on the hopelessly ignorant masses by force. So when we say that the initiation of force is evil, that should tie in now to, in a negative way, to all the things we learned about justice, egoism, objectivity, reason as man's means of survival, etc. Now, I have a whole bunch of questions. I don't know how all that time... I put in some things that I hadn't put in the last time. Hopefully they were helpful, but they took some time. Let me give you the assignment before I run out of time, and then I'll try to do a few questions. We have until 4 minutes after, so we have 8 minutes, 7 minutes, so I'll do what I can. The assignment is to induce the principle that sex is metaphysical. That's a big switch now. And there's a lot of psychological elements in this topic that I'm not going to hold you responsible for, because I'm not responsible for them either. But do what you can. I am not going to require you to reduce the concept sex. You just take it for granted that sex involves genital contact and arousal, and that's all we're going to say about it. You don't have to dazzle me or yourself with the inductive varieties and possibilities. I'll even tell you that we can use as metaphysical a definition pertaining to reality as a whole. For example, the law of identity is metaphysical. It pertains to reality as a whole. So, there's no problem. There's a 3-word proposition, is, you know, and the other two I've already defined. Now, there's something obviously here that has to be thought about, because the law of identity is metaphysical. It's everywhere. Sex is metaphysical. You don't mean it's everywhere. I mean, that's only true for Frenchmen. So, you're going to have to figure out what is meant by this statement. And then what observations, obviously it has to be observations about sex, about sexual behavior, will lead you to this conclusion. What is the correct interpretation of this conclusion? What is meant by saying it's metaphysical? And how are you led to that by observations about sex? What inductions do you have to perform? And it's really very complex, and it happens to be a thing where the genus is also very helpful in that particular instance. Now, I have a couple of minutes. I think I've said enough about this question. And a brief answer to the Australian questioner who said, I see why an implicit pleasure-pain standard for your list of initial common sense values wouldn't work. So how do you choose this list? By what standard? And the answer is you don't know any standard yet. At the beginning, when you start to ethics, you merely make a list of 10 or 12 common sense values that are present majorly in your daily life, and each of which makes sense to you within your context. And obviously life would be one. You'd rather live than die. But you don't know at this stage that life is the standard dictating all the others. You don't need a standard. You don't even need an exhaustive list. You start with a dozen major values: knowledge, wealth, health, strength. I gave a whole bunch, each one with its own logic up to a point. And then you see where you're led from there. If you say to me later in the question, well, couldn't an altruist start using a common sense list based on altruism? I covered that in the class. If it's an inconsistency he will grasp the clash later as he proceeds. If he's completely consistent in his initial, quote, common sense list, he'll die, because all of his values will become methodically anti-life, so he'll walk into a truck for the first person, so he'll never get to his induction. Now this questioner says, but aren't you assuming life as the standard implicitly by taking all these proper values? I say, yes, implicitly, but that doesn't make it circular, because it's only implicit. Any more than you could say, well, when you use concepts, aren't you implicitly relying on measurement omission? Yes, but I don't need to start with that as my premise to come to the conclusion of what concepts are.
Never get there.
So I can't continue this back and forth. I would like to come to Australia and talk about this in greater depth, but that's the most I can do on that topic. But try not to think of it as a rationalist. Here's my standard. Think of it as an empiricist net. Here are the values that are important to me within my knowledge now. Now, what can I tell about who the beneficiary should be? And then as you acquire more values, you check back. Does it integrate or does it conflict? That's how you finally get to life as the standard. You don't start at the age of 8 or 18 with a standard and say, now I'm picking all my values, because where would the standard come from? Now, I got 1 minute to do this one. When Kant says we are cut off from true reality, what stolen concepts is he counting? And I would answer that like this. For Kant, all concepts are stolen, because he attacks the fundamentals of all concept formation. Existence is unknowable and therefore inconceivable, therefore he can't have any concept of it. And consciousness is impossible, because for him, if it has identity, if it functions by some means, it can't be aware of anything. And therefore, he denies consciousness and existence. Well, then what is he got a concept of, and by what means? So as soon as he opens his mouth to speak, even the is a stolen concept for Kant, because the conceptual faculty is negated at its root. And that is all I can get in tonight, or this morning, whatever time of day or night it is. So I will say farewell until next time.